everybody. Today in the workshop, we're going to do something a little bit different. A while back, I was selling some of my Warhammer 40K stuff online. A guy came over to pick them up and we started talking, and he mentioned that he was just getting into Warhammer 40K. I told him I've been playing since second edition, and we struck up a conversation. I ended up talking about getting miniatures painted. And he said that he and his group were just getting started with the game, just getting started in the hobby, just getting started painting miniatures. So I extended an offer to him. I said, if you can come up with a paint scheme that you would like to see done, let me know and I'll paint up a couple of your miniatures and I'll put together a video to show you how I did it and the paints used, etc., etc. So they had two armies that they want to have done. The first one is Tau, and the second one is Thousand Suns. And he painted up one of his miniatures in the paint scheme that he would like to have done, and he brought that one over as well as another blank one, unpainted one. And so this is the video showing him my tutorial for how I'm painting up his color scheme. So this video is probably going to have a little bit more in the way of instruction for techniques and the reasons why I do certain things, because they are just getting into painting, and so I want to offer them a little bit more advice rather than just the colors I'm using. So let's get started. Okay, to start with, as with any other project, the first thing we're going to do is priming. Now, I have primed this guy in black rather than red because we always want to start from the lowest parts of the model to the most raised parts of the model. It's easier to paint the armor plates on top of the black background. It's easier to do that than to paint this or prime this red and then try to paint all of the undergarments underneath all of the armor plates. So I am painting this guy black, and I use Army Painter matte black. Now you can use pretty much any black primer for this. You can use Citadel Chaos Black. You could probably even get away with like a hobby store rattle can of just matte black, but I like Army Painter. It's consistent and it's a really, really good color with a good finish. So this guy's all done, and now we're going to move on to starting to paint all of the bits of the armor plate on top of this black. Okay, so we're going to be painting up all of the armor bits on this guy, and for the armor we are using Citadel Mephiston red. So it's just going to be one or two coats for each of these armor plates. I'm going to be careful not to get as much as I can onto the black, but we will be going back at some point and just doing a cleanup pass, so it's not super critical. So let's just lay on this color and move on to the next bit. All right, so the red pass looks good. It's nice and dry. Our second step is to add some details to the shoulder pads and the gauntlets, the knee pads, some details on the rifle and on the backpack. And for that, we are using Citadel Liberator Gold. And we're just going to lay that in those areas as a first coat and see how it looks. All right, so we have the red layer and the gold layer in. Our next step is to paint some details on the insignia on the chest, on the shoulder piece, as well as the helmet. And for those areas, we're using Citadel Wraithbone. Now, I thought at this point I would explain a little bit about how I do this. So my normal procedure for painting is I'm going to lay in all of the base colors and then go back and clean them up, touch up the little, make all the lines straight, make sure there isn't any overpainting, get all of the base coats set in perfectly. Then I'm going to go in and start doing my line work, my shading, and my highlighting. And the reason for that is the reason for getting the base coats nice and tidy is because once you start doing the shading and the highlighting, it's really going to be a lot more difficult to go back in and touch up the base colors if you have to. So having said that, we're going to go ahead and lay in the Wraithbone highlight colors and paint the helmet. All right, all of our base coating is done. And I went ahead, I added a extra coat to the Wraithbone and touched up a couple of areas on the red and the black and cleaned up some of the lines just to make sure that we were ready for our for the start of our detailing. So the first thing we're going to do is lay in some panel lines. There's panel lines on the thigh armor. There's some panel lines on the shoulder around here. There's the circle around the chest, and there are some on the top of the helmet. Now, there are a lot of products that you can use for line work. Almost every manufacturer of paint has their own version of line paint. I really like using Tamiya panel line accent color. This is an oil-based product, so I always use the applicator that it comes with. It's nice and small. And it also means that you want to make sure that you give more time for this to dry completely. But I really, really like this product. It moves. You just have a little, you just put a little dab of it and it just moves right along the panels. It's really, really nice and it's a very good product. So all we're going to be doing is taking some of this and we're literally just dabbing in these areas and you can see, boom, there it is. Now, especially with models this small, it is going to be a little bit messy. There is going to be some cleanup in these areas, but all we do is just lay this in all of the recesses and all the panel lines. A little dab, just one dab should take care of it. See how it just immediately spreads out? and creates that nice little dark panel line. So I'm just going to go in and put a little dab in all these areas. You can see how it spreads out. It makes kind of a mess, but we know that that's going to happen, and we're going to come in and do a cleanup, a tidying up of the areas to either side of the panel line. I think it's totally worth it, because when you see those delicate little panel lines that stick out after we're all done, it really gives some depth to the miniature. And it doesn't really take that long to get everything done. It's just a little dab here and a little dab there. We're going to also do the top of the helmet. And you can see how that, now obviously that's a big blob, and we will take care of that when we clean up, but you'll see how nice it looks afterwards. And also for the backgrounds of areas like this really tight area where all of the lenses and stuff are, we're going to put some in the back for the background of that area. You can already see how nice that looks. And this is literally just to define some of the line work around the model and give it a little bit more depth. And I'm just taking a quick look around. Now, obviously, you know, we're not going to do any of the black areas because you wouldn't see it. But all of the red areas look really good. Even these gold areas, like the gauntlets, we want to accentuate those lines. The little pads on the hands, we want to accentuate that. There's some line work on this antenna on the helmet. There we go. And I usually do this part either at the end of the day or the first part, so I can leave it overnight to dry, or I can leave it all day to dry and then do some more work in the evening. Because you really, really want to make sure that this, because it is an oil-based product, you really, really want to make sure that it is completely dry before you try to paint over it. And a couple of more spots back here on the back. And this is one of those things where it's kind of personal preference. You know, you don't have to do every single panel line. I'm not going to do any that are, you know, removed or way back in the recesses of the miniature. You wouldn't see those anyway. But I'm just going around and I'm having a look, seeing where some of those obvious lines are, and getting this taken care of. And that looks pretty good. All right, so there's one more little area that we are going to paint while the liner paint is drying, and that's these little bits of exposed skin right at the base of the leg. There's the so there's the leg garment, there's a little bit of exposed skin, and then there are the black like toenails. So we're going to paint the skin. The base color we're going to use is Citadel Fenrisian gray. And then once that base is on, as with the other areas, we will give it a wash and some highlighting. And since this is pretty far away from the areas that we use the line color on, I'm not worried about these getting mixed in with the oil paint. And I'm going to be relatively careful with these areas, but I'm not going to worry about overpainting because we can just come in and clean that up with some black later on. Okay, so all of our panel line areas are thoroughly dry, and we are ready to start doing our base coat touch-ups. This is going to be getting ready in preparation for doing the shadowing and the highlighting. And we're going to take our Mephiston red, our Wraithbone, and our Liberator gold and just go over these areas where we have a lot of overpaint with the line work and fill in the base color again so that it can be nice and clean before we start doing the highlighting and the shadowing with glazing. So I'm going to start with the Mephiston red. And the important thing at this point is we want to fill in the big areas of color, but we don't want to get any paint in those lines. We want those to stay nice and dark. So take your time. This isn't difficult. It's just you want to take your time and not get a lot of paint in those line areas. Definitely helpful to thin your paints a little bit for this because it makes them flow a little bit easier. But we're going to get this taken care of, and then we can get started on our shading and highlighting. All right, so all of our cleanup is dry, and we're going to start moving into the detail work, the highlighting and the shading. And I thought I would start with the black areas because they don't really need any shading because they're black. So we're going to do some edge highlighting. So we're going to use 3 different colors to kind of build up the highlighted areas for the black. The first one is going to be Citadel Eshin gray. And you're also going to want to thin the paint out a little bit because you really want some nice, smooth flow for this. So put a little bit of water in with your Eshin gray. And the whole idea with this pass is that we're going to hit large areas that are going to be highlighted. Now, there are lots of techniques for figuring out areas to highlight. You can always just go and look at the raised areas. There are a lot of great folds on this cloth area here, and I'm just hitting the higher areas. You can also even, take a light source and shine it down from on top of the miniature and see where the light actually falls. That's a great way to do it. Whatever your technique, we're going to fill in large areas with the Eshin gray, and then we're going to use our other 2 grays to do a middle pass where we're filling in smaller areas, and then we're going to use our lightest gray for just the edge highlighting on the very small edge areas just to bring out that last little bit of light. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this pass, and then we will move on to our medium gray. Okay, we're now moving on to our middle, the second of the three grays for the highlight. For this one, I am using Citadel Dawnstone. It's a little bit lighter than the Eshin. Again, we're going to want to thin it down with some water to make sure it flows nice. And for this pass, we're going to be following the areas that we did with the Eshin gray, putting a little bit of the Dawnstone on it, but not covering the entire area, just a little bit less. And then with our third lightest gray, we're going to be doing just the very tips of everything. And one thing I forgot to mention in the section where we were doing the Eshin gray, it's really easy to go overboard and just highlight everything. You really want to kind of do less is more with your highlighting passes. So make sure that you're being a little conservative about the areas that you are highlighting. I think it will give you a better result. So I'm just going to go and put in some medium gray in these highlights, and then we'll come back and do the detail highlighting. Okay, and now we are ready for our pin or edge or detail highlighting. This is our lightest gray, and for that I am using Citadel Administratum gray or Administratum gray. Once again, as with the other two grays, we're going to give it a little bit of water so it flows off the bristles of the brush. And as I mentioned before, for this pass, we are just doing the very tops of the highlighted areas. Sometimes it's just even a dot. We're just hitting the very tops of these areas just to give it a little pop. And then when we're done with this, we're going to do what's called a blending layer. I'll show you that once we're done. I'm going to get these little areas finished, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so we are going to finish up our highlighting of the dark black or the black areas with the blending layer. And the blending layer is essentially just taking some Citadel Nuln oil shade and going over all of the areas that we just highlighted. And what that does is it kind of well, it kind of blends all the colors together. It gives them an opaque overlay and makes the colors not quite so contrasting. So it's a nice little way, I think, to help the highlights be a little bit more natural looking. So we're going to go ahead and take our brush and just start laying in. Now this obviously doesn't have to be thinned at all because it's a shade paint, so it's already nice and thin. You just want to go hit all of the black areas that we just did the highlight work on. And once it's dry, it'll give it a nice effect. It won't be quite so extreme. Knocks it down just enough. All right, we are closing in on finishing up our model. I am going to, before we start doing the last two bits, the Wraithbone and the red areas, I want to do a couple of quick shading washes. The first one we're going to do is for the skin. And for that wash, for that shading wash, I'm going to use Citadel Space Wolves Gray contrast. And just like with the blending pass with the Nuln oil, all we're going to do is just lay in our shade right on top of the lighter blue. And it's going to do its job for us. And then once that shading layer is dry, I'll go in and do a quick highlight. All right, so the wash on the skin is done. The second shading wash I'm going to do is all of the bronze or gold areas. And for that, I am going to use Citadel Seraphim Sepia shade. I like Seraphim Sepia as opposed to like an Agrax Earthshade because it's a little warmer and a little bit more subtle. Sometimes I'll do a couple of passes on it just to build up the color a little bit more, but I overall I like the effect of Seraphim Sepia for this application. So all I'm going to do is lay in a layer on the shaded areas of the gold, and we'll probably come and do a second pass, like I said, just to build up the color a little bit more. All right, our shade on the skin and the gold areas is dry, and I'm just going to lay in a quick highlight. So for the skin areas, we're going to go back to the original color, Citadel Fenrisian Gray. And this is just going to be a very quick dotting of Fenrisian Gray on the skin to give it a little contrast. Just several small areas on the very top of this skin area and a little bit on these spurs. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so for the gold highlights, I am going back to the base color, the Liberator gold. I am mixing in a little bit of white. Now you can use pretty much any white you want. I'm using Citadel White Scar. The idea is just to give a little bit of a lighter version of the Liberator gold. And again, just like with the skin, we are just picking out little areas to highlight just to give those edges a little bit of a lighter color. All right, we have two areas left, the Wraithbone and the Mephiston red. So we're going to do the Wraithbone first. I'm going to lay in a little bit of shading using Citadel Apothecary White Contrast. And just like using the Seraphim Sepia on the gold areas, we're just going to want to lay in a little bit of shading, just some suggestions, not huge areas. We're just going to lay in a little layer and let it do its own thing. Mainly on the lower sections of the helmet. And we also want to make sure we get the large dot on the chest and a little bit on the insignia on the side, on the shoulder guard. All right, that looks pretty good. All right, so we are down to the last couple of areas we need to do. The first thing, well, not the first thing, but the three last areas that we have to do, we're going to do some highlighting on the white areas, and then we're going to do the shading and the highlighting on the red areas. But before we get into that, I thought I was thinking about this earlier, I thought I would share a tip for using your brushes and stuff. One of the important parts of this, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see, one of the important parts of being able to paint effectively is having a secure hold on your mini. I use these Citadel miniature holders. I think they're really good. They do a really good job. But you also want to have your arms and your hands secure. And what I mean by that is when I paint, my left arm is resting on the table. Okay, so that's one secure point. My other right arm is also resting on the table so that it's just my wrist and my hand that's free. And a lot of times, you may even notice this in some of my other videos, you'll see me, I put a finger or two on the miniature holder, a finger or two of my right hand. And that adds another secure connection to the miniature. So really the only thing that's moving is going to be my thumb and my index finger and my middle finger of my right hand as I'm putting the paint on. This is going to give you a much more secure and stable platform than if you weren't holding anything and you were just trying to paint with your arms floating out and your right hand not secured to the miniature base. This is not as secure. And I think that you'll find that you're going to get a lot more success. Your lines are going to be cleaner. Your painting is going to be nicer when you have yourself secured like this on the tabletop and on the miniature holder. All right, so let's get started with these last areas. So for the, we're going to start by doing the shading on the red areas, and then that will just leave us with the highlighting of the red and the highlighting of the white. So for all of these applications, we're going to be doing something called glazing. So glazing is a little bit different than what we did for the black areas. The black areas, we just used a shading compound. Well, in this case, we didn't because it was black, but normally you would use a shade like Agrax Earthshade or Nuln oil to do the darker areas. And then you just use regular old paint that is thinned a little bit to do the lighter areas. For glazing, we're going to take our regular paint. So for instance, for the dark areas of the red, we're going to be using Citadel Khorne red. But instead of just thinning it out, we're going to mix one part of Khorne red with one part of the Lahmian medium and one part of water. The difference with adding the Lahmian medium is the color doesn't uh, doesn't get diluted as much as when you're just mixing it with water. And so with glazing, essentially what you're doing is you're laying on multiple layers of very thin paint. So it's a subtler way of doing highlighting and shading. It takes a little longer, but the effects are a lot more subtle. And I think for certain applications, it's a really nice way to do it. So we're just going to take a little bit of our Khorne red. And so the mix is typically about a third, a third, and a third. You know, one part of each, the water, the Lahmian media, and your color. That's not a hard and fast rule, but that's typically what I use. The important thing is that once you get it all mixed up, you want to have a consistency that's pretty thin. So when you are trying it out here, if we just did this, see how nice and thin that is? It's not going on like a thick paint right out of the pot. And the reason we want it to be thin is so that we can control it a little bit better when we're adding the layers onto the miniature. So it's not just one pass and it's color and it's on. Glazing, you're typically going to use maybe, I don't know, 5 to 10 passes. But there's a really cool thing with glazing that always makes me smile every time I do it. Glazing sneaks up on you. You'll be putting in your, you'll be doing your brush strokes and you'll be putting it in and and adding another layer and adding another layer. And then all of a sudden you see it. It's not super obvious. It kind of sneaks up on you. And that's how you kind of know when you're done, because you suddenly see the effect and it's really, really nice. So that's why I like using glazing for a lot of things. Now, you could certainly do glazes for all of these areas, the black areas, the white areas. You can do combination of glazing and traditional dry brushing and shading. Totally up to you. This is just how I like to do this particular miniature. So we've got our Khorne red ready to go as a glaze. And what I like to do is just start in one area and we're just going to work around and with the shade you're only hitting the bottom parts of these red areas. Wherever it would be darker, it's the opposite of the highlighting. So right at the bottom of each of these articulation areas, the bottom of each of these plates, and you can do large areas as well. So like the bottom, this whole bottom section of this shoulder plate is going to be glazed for shading. So this is very much a get comfortable, take your time, don't rush kind of a situation. Make sure you have plenty of glaze mixed up. And then, like I said, you're just going to go around and around. Don't forget to get in between the red, in between the fingers here, the bottom parts of the rifle housing, the red rifle housing. And then we're back where we started, so we're just going to keep going around. I'm going to just go ahead and finish up a few passes of this, and then we will move on to the highlighting. And our shading pass is dry. Not sure how well this shows up on camera, but in person it looks really, really nice. That dark glaze really did its job. So our next step is to do the highlighting for the red areas. For the highlights, we're going to be using Citadel Evil Sunz Scarlet, and it's the same procedure. We're going to be mixing 1 part Evil Sunz Scarlet with 1 part of the Lahmian media and 1 part of water. And I have my mixture ready to go. So we're going to be focusing on the top areas of things. So if you were to hold your miniature and put a light source shining down from the top, you would be focusing on where that light hits. So for instance, this center piece right here, we're going to be doing just the very top here and the very top on the bottom piece. And we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to start in one spot and just work our way all around the model and just keep rotating and painting as we go until we get the intensity that we like. So let's get to it. All right, we are down to our last bit. This highlighting pass looks really good. Let me see if I can bring it up here. It actually looks pretty good on camera too. I'm very happy with the results of that. So our last bit that we need to do is highlighting the Wraithbone areas. So I've already mixed the glaze. This is the same thing. 1 part Wraithbone, 1 part Lahmian media, 1 part water. I've already mixed up the glaze, and we're just going to start laying in some layers. And once I've got the color built up to where I like it, that'll be it. And we are essentially finished. All the big parts have been done. The white highlights have been done. I forgot to mention in the last segment, I had mentioned that I was mixing Wraithbone, and it wasn't. I needed a white scar or any white you could use for the glazing for the Wraithbone areas. But that's all done. That came out nicely. We're down to just a couple of detail bits that I'm going to put some paint on, and then we can do the flocking for the base. So I noticed right here, this little ear protection here on the other test model that I did was Liberator Gold. So I'm going to go in and just dot that like so. We also want to do some cool lens colors in these front areas. There's two little lenses and one big one. So I think I'm going to do one of the small lenses in red, and we're just going to dot it. And we're going to do the other one in a green. And you can really use, these are so small, you can use anything, any nice bright red and nice bright green. And then there's this larger lens on this side. I think I'm going to do that in a light blue. There we go. That looks pretty good. Also, I'm going to take my Abaddon black and just hit the end of this barrel so it doesn't look, so it looks like it's hollow. There we go. And with that, our mini is done. I'm going to let these last little bits dry real quick, and then we're going to move on to talk about texturing the base. Be right back. All right, so we are going to texture our base. For this guy, for the initial texture, I'm using AK Terrain's Dark Earth, which I think, given the color scheme on this guy, I think is going to look really nice. Kind of like mud once you put it on. So this is what it looks like. We're just going to grab a decent sized brush, and all we're doing is just laying it on. For these guys, I'm not doing down the side of the base. I'm just doing the very top. So all we want to do is just give a nice coat. We don't want to brush it too hard because I want it to be textured and three-dimensional. I don't want it to be super flat. So we're just going to lay in a bunch, and then we'll let that dry, and then we'll give it a wash, and we'll give it some highlighting, and maybe we'll add a little grass or something. All right, our texture is nice and dry, so we're going to give it a wash to seep in and darken the recesses. And for that, we're using Citadel Agrax Earthshade. So we're just going to grab a medium-sized brush and paint this on. Now, with shading, just like with the Nuln oil. You just want to get it on there, give it a good coat, let it seep in, let it dry, and then we will move on to the two highlight passes. I'm not worried about overpainting on the sides here because I'm going to hit those with a Baden black when we're all done. That'll be the last thing we do. So that coat is on. We're going to let it dry. All right, we are down to our last couple of steps. We have the base texture is on, it's dried. We did the wash, and the wash is dry to get in the cracks and give a little bit more accent to the dark areas. And our next step is to do some highlighting. I'm going to do a 2-color highlight, slightly lighter and then much lighter for the very tips. So I'll be able to show you how that looks once we're done. For our first step, we're going to be using Citadel Baneblade Brown. And this is a dry brush technique. So what we do for dry brushing is we get a little bit of paint, and I like to use a round dry brush rather than a square dry brush, because I typically will dry brush in like circular motions, and I just think the finished look is nicer for most applications. I still use square dry brushes for some things. But for all dry brush techniques, you're going to load up your brush with a bunch of paint. And then we're going to use our paper towel and just get rid of most of it. And then bringing in our model, we're just going to start passing over the top. And you can already see what that does. We're just hitting, we don't have a whole lot of paint on the brush, and we're using a very light pressure. So all it's doing is depositing paint on the tops of these peaks. And we don't need a whole lot. We just want a nice little contrast between the initial color and the darker shade. So that's going to look pretty good. And so we're going to do the exact same thing. We're coming back with our Wraithbone, and we're just going to do the same thing, except for this pass, we're going to load up our brush just like we did before. But on this pass, we're going to be using an even lighter pressure, because all we're doing on this pass is just getting the very, very top to give a little three-dimensional quality to everything. So we're not trying to cover the entire area like we did with the main color or the initial dry brush. It's just the very, very tops of things. So you get a nice little 3-color layer effect. And I think that looks pretty good. So our next step is to take some of our, we're going to go back to our Agrax, or not our Agrax, our Abaddon Black. And I'm going to take the model off of the holder. And all we're going to do here is go around the rim of the base and just make sure that we're just tidying up some of these areas where we got some of the dry brushing and some of the washing on. Sometimes I will texture the entire base. Sometimes I will just do the very top, as in this case. It really is, it depends on the game system that I'm painting miniatures for, and it also just kind of depends on what I'm feeling like. Sometimes doing the whole base looks really cool. Sometimes just doing the very top gives it a nice style. So we're just going to finish this up. And that's done. And now we're going to let that dry. And then we're going to add a little bit of extra interesting terrain to it. And then we're going to give it a clear top coat. And then we are done. So let's talk about terrain flocking and just different terrain elements you can add to your base. I've collected quite a collection actually over the years. This is what I use just for standard grass. This would be for standard, like a desert kind of a thing. And then I have a mix in case I don't want to commit to either one. These are all just different bags of different kinds of terrain flocking that are kind of one-offs that I have. These are special items such as 3D printed mushrooms and things that I can use for some cool effects on some of my fantasy guys. These I think are just tags. Those are tags. Here is some of the coarser. These would be for like bushes and brush. That's the lighter color. There's the darker color in there. This is all so little pebbles, which are great for rocky terrain. Crushed up cork, which is really excellent for rocky terrain. Again, just lots of different colored items. These are my grasses. These are what I'm going to be using today. Actually, I think this particular card is what I'm going to use today, so I'm going to set that aside. What else do we have? Different sand colored powders, larger rocks, more one-offs. Those I'm using to build little features, little lumber features and things. That's the main bit of gravel that I have, and there's all kinds of different sizes in here, so it's very, very useful. And large boulders, and then more wood scrap. So as I said, today we're going to be using these, and I will be applying them in just one sec. All right, so to apply these tufts, all we're going to do is grab some white glue. We're going to decide where on the model we'd like them to go. I think I'm going to do two, one in the front and one in the back. So let's put one right by his left leg. And then we're going to spin him around, and let's put one kind of in the middle. So just put a little drop of white glue on there, and then we're going to go to our card. You may have noticed before, these come in different sizes. So there are small ones on this end, larger ones on this end. Because I'm putting two on, I'm going to just put two small ones. So all we're doing is we're grabbing the tuft with our tweezers and laying it on the base, and then giving it a nice little tap to make sure it is seated properly. And then we're going to do the same thing with the front. Put it on there. Make sure it is seated properly. And there you go. And we have a finished base. Now that white glue, once that dries, that's going to be clear, so you won't see any of this white here. And you know, you can do any kind of terrain you want. You can paint up the base and flock it, or not flock it, or just leave it the way it is. That's totally up to you. So get creative with it. Anyway, we're going to let this dry, and then we're going to do a clear top coat, and he will be ready for the tabletop. All right, I just finished top coating our miniature, and I just wanted to take a quick minute to let you know that my um, matte varnish of choice is Army Painter matte varnish. I know there's a lot of other brands out there. I used to use Tester's Dull Coat a lot. I happen to like this particular brand, so I just wanted to put that out there for full disclosure. And in just a second, we're going to take a look at the finished product. And here is the finished product. 2 Tau infantrymen ready to get on the tabletop. Thank you all for watching this video. I know it was a little longer than normal, but like I said, I was sharing a lot of extra information regarding techniques and things. And for Mr. B and his group, I hope this video is really helpful for you guys. Let me know how you like it, and we will see you in the next video where I will be taking on their 1000 Sunz miniatures. Take care. Bye-bye.